My name is Mykaell Riley. I was born in the second city, better known as Birmingham. And within that city, I hail from a little village called Handsworth, the capital of black folk in the Midlands. Actually, my early influences was jazz, because my dad was into jazz. So I hated it, as kind of kids do. Anything your parents are into, you hate. But it becomes part of my subconscious library. And then it was things like, well, artists like Val Doonigan and Perry Como that my mom would purchase, which was actually typical of Jamaican households, because there's always a combination of what was acceptable within a religious community. And that tended to be American folk artists. And then jazz, because a lot of the time there was no lyrics. It was a steady diet of the BBC, which was absolutely unavoidable. That was national radio, so it was everywhere, omnipresent, and whether you liked it or not, it was part of your listening experience. So artists all the way back to people like Petula Clark, Stevie Winwood, the Stones I was into, Yes, believe it or not, and Bowie. Bowie's like high on my list as well. So I'm a pop animal, really. I'm not really a reggae animal. Most Caribbeans in the late 50s were looking for a better life, and the option was, the first was New York, America, and the second option was the UK. And there was such a rush for America that they closed it down. They made it very difficult for Caribbeans to migrate to America. And at the same time, there's a shout out from Britain saying, come to Britain, streets are paved with gold, you can make a wonderful life in Britain. There's loads of jobs. But you had to be qualified, and my dad was a welder. So he had the opportunity to come over. And then my mom came over, and my elder brothers and sisters I didn't see until I was about 15, which was the norm. But they came over for work, and they planned to go back within about 5 years. 50 years later, they were still here.
So when your parents arrived, did they find it really difficult? Did they find the work that they were looking for, or was it a lot harder than they imagined?
The work for everyone was a lot harder, but more than the work, it was the community, which was in many cases hostile. The climate was hostile, and if you arrive assuming you're going to be accepted, it's even more of a shock. If you've been brought up to worship the Queen, which they did in the Caribbean, and then you arrive and the Queen is not there to greet you, in fact she's hostile towards you, then it's a bit of a shock to the system. So back in the 50s, it wasn't unusual to be fearful of going out on your own. It wasn't unusual to be stopped by the police. It was not unusual, said Tom Jones. It was the norm very quickly for people to assume that they'd been lied to and that they need to leave. The challenge was that you'd already got used to a potential for earning, and people were sending back money, and there was nowhere to go in a lot of cases. So you stayed and you tried to make it work. But the 50s, the 60s were very, very difficult times. And of course, the country was recovering as well. By the time we hit the 70s, we had a new government coming in, a right-wing government that was particularly hostile to Caribbeans. We had Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech, which said whites are going to be outnumbered in the next 2 decades, and that the Caribbean offspring is going to be competing for jobs. And within a space of about 5 years, they changed the law almost as many times to stop the immigration of Caribbeans to the UK. So, it was a lot of families like mine, it was desperate to get siblings into the country before they were locked out. And in that mad rush, I met my brother and sister 15 years down the line.
That must have been a bit strange.
It was particularly strange because they arrived one Christmas, and my brother arrived, took his shoes off, and ran down the garden in the snow. We were looking at him going, we don't know him, do we? We're not going to tell anyone he did that because it just looked ridiculous. And for him, snow was a new experience. But it was very odd. But like I say, in a lot of families, it was very normal.
So your parents you had quite a religious family then, quite, you sort of into gospel music?
To be fair, my mom was. My dad wasn't having any of that. But we had to do what our mom said. And so it meant we were bussed to church every Sunday. And we were part of choir, church choir. I was part of the school choir. We were mainly at the back of church for the girls, but I mean, we had to go every Sunday.
So is that where you got your love of singing from?
I thought it was going to lovers. Sorry. Love of singing. Appreciation for live vocals, for live performance. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about Black Church was it was on occasions riotous, it was energetic, it was a mountain of expression of all kinds. I mean, it was hysterical on occasions because if you're born in Britain and you grown up in Britain, we also viewed some of this as alien. You know, we were there, we were trying to understand what was taking place, but on occasions when people went into a trance in church, that was just strange. But in terms of vocal performances, fantastic vocal performances, and it was a chance to see seasoned musicians because each church had a band, and you'd aspire to be in the church band because you had an audience that only said nice things about you. So that was fantastic. I was supposed to be in the Air Force. That's where I was going. So I was part of something called the ATC, Air Training Corps. And I was going to be an electrician and a pilot. No one told me about the glass ceiling and racism. They didn't tell me about that. They said, you're going to be a pilot and you're going to join the Air Force. And so I joined the ATC, and I was in it for 4 years whilst at school. And I did glider pilots. I learned to shoot 303 Royal Enfield rifles that will kill you at a distance of a mile. So, you know, that was great fun when you're kind of 15, 16. But that's where I was going. When the Air Force said, sorry, you cannot join us as electrician. And I said, why? And they said, you got flat feet. And I said, but it's a plane. It's a plane.
But you're doing electric.
And I want to do electrics. And I went, well, there are no places at the moment. And I said, but I've already passed the entrance exam because I've been in the ATC for years. And it was just excuse after excuse after excuse. And at the same time, we started going for jobs. And you start to realise that you couldn't get a job. And you had white mates that you went around with, and you'd go in for the job, and they, sorry mate, the job's just gone. And you'd send your white mate in, and they go, there's the job. And then we'd go back in together and say, got you. It didn't mean I got the job, but it did highlight that there was something here now within society that was different for me than it was for my white mates. And at the same time, I was in the band because this is the first band, Steel Pulse. We started at school and we were all part of the school choir, and we were getting into music. We all come from a similar background, and we recognised that at school we were never taught anything other than your heritage is a grass skirt somewhere out in the bush somewhere, and that, you know, Tarzan's smarter than you guys. He can speak to all the animals. It's kind of a weird history that you're getting. It just complicated my identity back then. you know, and my aspirations. And so, having been turned down by the Air Force, I still tried to be an electrician. So I did an electrical apprenticeship and a plumbing apprenticeship whilst being in the band, which I could not tell my parents I was in, because back in the 70s, joining a reggae band was like saying I am joining a hot kind of course that will qualify me to go to prison.
And what attracted you to reggae in particular?
At the time, it was the message, really, because we grew up on artists like Burning Spear, Bob Marley, the Heptones, and it was what was called conscious lyrics. The lyrics actually told you a story, gave you a narrative that we didn't get anywhere else at all. And it was a narrative that we could relate to because it was coming from the Caribbean. It was in an accent we understood, and it came from a place that we kind of aspired to as well, because back in the 70s, if you said back home, you were going back to the Caribbean. If you said holiday, you were going to the Caribbean. There's no this Spain stuff. You know, you were going to the Caribbean. And the lyrics spoke about the challenges of being poor, the challenges of being shut out of society, and ways of understanding and dealing with that were kind of practical. And so we recognized that. It also spoke about being black in a way that it wasn't discussed even in the family circles. It wasn't discussed at school. So it was about identity. And for us, first generation, the big question was, are you British or are you Jamaican? That was the big question. And what these lyrics said is, you're a person first. And you come from the oldest community, which is African, and everyone comes from that community. So within reggae, it became that kind of outlet, that escapism.